Welcome to Midnight Whispers, the place where shadows cling to the ridges and ordinary people bring their darkest memories to light. Tonight we're heading deep into the Appalachian Mountains, a stretch of land so old, so restless, it feels alive. These are not campfire tales dreamed up to spook kids. They're true stories, whispered by hikers, locals, and travelers who swear they saw something watching them from the trees. Some of these accounts go back generations, twisting folklore and first-hand encounters together until you can't tell where the legend ends and the nightmare begins. If you're new here, settle in. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us each week for more true stories from places that never forget. Now, take a breath and step off the trail with me. The first story waits just beyond the tree line. Story 1. Gold that devours men. I should have listened to the old man at the gas station when he warned me about the abandoned mine shaft on Copper Ridge. But when you read desperate for work and someone offers you $5,000 cash to survey an old mining claim, you done to ask too many questions. The GPS died 3 miles up the mountain road. My cell phone had been useless since I left the interstate, and now even the radio was nothing but static. The October mist clung to my windshield like ghostly fingers, and the deeper I drove into the Appalachian wilderness, the more I began to understand why this place had been forgotten. The mining claim sat on a narrow ledge carved into the mountainside, accessible only by a dirt track that hadn't seen maintenance in decades. Ancient oak trees pressed in from both sides, their branches scraping against my truck like skeletal hands. When I finally reached the end of the road, I sat in my cab for a moment, staring at what remained of the old mining operation. Rusted equipment lay scattered across the site like the bones of some massive creature. A wooden head frame, weathered gray as driftwood, stood guard over a black hole that dropped straight down into the mountain. His heart. But what caught my attention wasn't the obvious danger of the open shaft. It was the silence. No birds, no insects, no wind rustling through the leaves. The mountain held its breath around this place, as if nature itself was afraid to disturb whatever lay sleeping in the darkness below. I grabbed my surveying equipment and approached the mine entrance, my boots crunching on gravel that sparkled with flecks of quartz and something else. Something that glinted gold in the fading afternoon light. As I knelt to examine the stones more closely, I noticed they weren't randomly scattered. They formed a rough circle around the mine shaft, like some kind of barrier or warning. The client had been vague about the history of this place. All he said was that 2 Scottish immigrants had worked this claim back in the 1890s, and that the mine had been abandoned suddenly under mysterious circumstances. He wanted me to determine if the tunnels were stable enough for modern excavation equipment. I lowered my measuring tape into the shaft. 20 feet, 40 feet, 60 feet down, and still no bottom. The metal tape trembled in my hands, and for a moment, I could have sworn I heard something echo up from the depths. Not quite a voice, but not quite wind either. Something in between that made my skin crawl. As I worked, positioning my transit and taking readings, the temperature began to drop. The mist grew thicker, rolling up from the valley below like smoke from some unseen fire. By the time I finished the preliminary survey, visibility had dropped to maybe 10 feet in any direction. The smart thing would have been to pack up and head back down the mountain before full darkness fell. But as I loaded my equipment back into the truck, I noticed something that made me pause. Fresh footprints in the mud near the mine entrance. Not mine. These were different, older somehow. The kind of deep impressions left by heavy work boots, the leather cracked and worn by years of hard labor. I followed the prints with my flashlight. They led from the mine shaft toward a cluster of rotting timber structures I hadn't noticed before. The mist parted as I approached, revealing the skeletal remains of what had once been a mining camp. A few cabins, their roofs caved in and walls leaning at impossible angles. A blacksmith, his forge, cold for over a century but still radiating a sense of recent use. The footprints led to the largest cabin, its door hanging open like a mouth frozen in a silent scream. I should have turned back then. Should have climbed in my truck and driven straight down that mountain road without looking back. Instead, I stepped through that doorway and into a nightmare that would follow me for the rest of my life. The cabin's interior was impossibly preserved, as if time had simply stopped the day it was abandoned. A pot of stew sat on the cold stove, the contents long since turned to black paste, but still recognizable as the remnants of a meal. 2 chairs flanked a rough wooden table, and on that table sat an oil lamp that flickered with impossible flame, casting dancing shadows on the walls. But it was what I saw beyond the lamp that froze my blood. A leather journal, its pages yellow with age, lay open to an entry dated October 15, 1893. The handwriting was shaky, desperate, written in what looked like rust-colored ink. Hamish is dead. God forgive me, but the gold made me do it. The vein runs deeper than we thought, deeper than any man should go. I can hear him calling to me from down there, begging me to bring him up. But I can't leave the gold. Not when we reach so close to the mother lode. The whispers from the mine tell me where to dig. They promise riches beyond measure, but the price, dear Christ, the price they demand. I flipped through the pages with trembling fingers. The entries chronicled the discovery of the gold vein, the growing tension between the two partners, and finally, the murder. But the final entries spoke of something else entirely. Something that had nothing to do with human greed and everything to do with forces that should never have been disturbed. The gold speaks to me now, shows me visions of wealth that would make kings weep with envy. But every nugget I pull from the earth costs me something. First my sleep, then my appetite, now my sanity. Hamish appears to me in dreams, warning me to stop, to seal the mine and flee this cursed place. But I can't stop. The gold won. They let me. The last entry was barely legible. The handwriting degraded to an almost illegible scrawl. They read coming up from the deep places, following the gold to the surface. Hamish was just the beginning. The mountain demands payment for its treasures, and I fear I've already given too much. If anyone finds this journal, know that the gold is cursed. The vein leads down to something older than the mountains themselves, something that hungers for human souls. I tried to collapse the tunnels, but they rebuild themselves in the night. The gold calls to them, and they answer, God help anyone who disturbs this place. A sound from outside made me look up from the journal. Footsteps, heavy boots on gravel, circling the cabin with methodical precision. But these weren't the sounds of a living person. The footfalls came with an odd rhythm, too slow, too deliberate, as if each step required tremendous effort. I extinguished my flashlight and crept to the window. Through the grimy glass, I could see shapes moving in the mist. Two figures, tall and gaunt, their clothes hanging in tatters from frames that seemed to shift and blur at the edges. One carried what looked like a pickaxe, its metal head gleaming with an unnatural light. The other held a lantern that cast no illumination but somehow made the darkness around it deeper. They were searching for something, their movements coordinated despite the fact that they never looked at each other or spoke. One would pause, cock his head as if listening to some inaudible sound, then point in a direction. The other would nod and shamble off into the mist, only to return moments later shaking his head in what looked like frustration. I pressed myself against the cabin wall, trying to control my breathing as the figures drew closer. Through the gaps in the rotting wood, I could hear them now. Not speaking, but making sounds. Wet, gurgling noises that might have been attempts at communication, or might have been something far worse. The door creaked open. I held my breath as one of the figures stepped into the cabin, its boots leaving muddy prints on the floor. Up close, I could see what remained of its face. What had once been a man now resembled something that had spent decades underwater. The flesh bloated and discolored. The eyes nothing but empty sockets that somehow still managed to convey a terrible hunger. The thing moved toward the table where the journal lay open, its head tilting at an unnatural angle as if reading the entries I had just discovered. Then it turned toward my hiding place behind the overturned crate, and I realized with growing horror that it knew I was there. But instead of moving toward me, it opened its mouth and spoke in a voice like wind through a graveyard. The gold calls to you, doesn't it? We can smell it on you. The desire, the need. It's the same hunger that brought us here all those years ago, and the same hunger that keeps us bound to this cursed place. The second figure appeared in the doorway, dragging something behind it. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized it was a burlap sack, heavy with what looked like ore samples. Gold ore, gleaming even in the dim light filtering through the cabin, its broken windows. We found the mother lode, just as the whispers promised. The first figure continued, its voice growing stronger, more human with each word. But the price was higher than we imagined. The mountain doesn't give up its treasures willingly. It demands payment in flesh and blood and souls. We paid that price, thinking we were clever enough to cheat the mountain of its due. We were wrong. The thing that had once been a man named Hamish stepped forward, his pickaxe scraping against the wooden floor. My partner killed me for the gold, struck me down in the darkness of the deep tunnels. But death wasn't the end. The mountain brought me back, bound me to this place along with him. We recondemned to guard the gold for eternity, warning away those who would repeat our mistakes. I wanted to run, to burst through the cabin door and race back to my truck, but something held me frozen in place. The gold in the burlap sack seemed to pulse with its own inner light, and I found myself drawn to it despite every rational thought screaming at me to flee. "You feel it, Don? To you?" the second figure said, and I realized this must be the murderer, the one whose journal I had read. The call of the gold. It's stronger than any drug, more compelling than any earthly desire. We try to resist it, even in death, but the mountain's grip is absolute. We rebound here until someone takes our place, until someone else falls under the gold, a spell, and pays the ultimate price. The bag of ore opened, spilling its contents across the cabin floor. Nuggets of pure gold, each one the size of a man, his fist, rolled toward me like living things. The sight of them filled me with a hunger I had never experienced before, a need so intense it threatened to drive out every other thought. "Take it," the figures whispered in unison. "Take the gold and be rich beyond measure. All you have to do is dig a little deeper, follow the vein down into the heart of the mountain. The whispers will guide you, show you where the real treasure lies hidden. Just ignore the screams that echo up from the depths. Ignore the things that move in the darkness below. The gold is all that matters." I reached for one of the nuggets, my hand trembling with anticipation. The metal was warm to the touch, almost alive, and as my fingers closed around it, I felt a surge of euphoria unlike anything I had ever experienced. Visions of wealth and power flooded my mind. I saw myself buying mansions, cars, anything my heart desired. The gold would make it all possible. But as the visions faded, I noticed something else. The two figures were smiling now, their rotting faces twisted into expressions of terrible joy. And I understood with dawning horror that I had made the same mistake that had doomed them over a century ago. I dropped the nugget and stumbled toward the door, but it slammed shut before I could reach it. The oil lamp on the table flared brighter, casting my shadow large and black against the cabin walls. And in that shadow, I could see something else. A third figure, taller than the others, with eyes that burned like coals in the darkness. "The mountain accepts your offering," it said in a voice like grinding stone. "The gold has claimed another guardian. Welcome to eternity." The last thing I remember is the sensation of falling, tumbling down through rotting floorboards into tunnels that stretched deeper than any natural cave system. The whispers grew louder as I fell, promising me riches and power if I would only serve faithfully, if I would only help guard the gold until the next fool came seeking easy wealth. They found my truck 3 days later, parked at the end of the mountain road with my surveying equipment still in the back. The official report listed me as missing, probably fallen into one of the many abandoned mine shafts that honeycomb the Appalachian Mountains. Search and rescue never found my body. But sometimes, when the mist rolls thick across Copper Ridge, locals report seeing 3 figures near the old mining claim. They carry lanterns that cast no light and move with the shambling gait of men who have been walking for over a century. They researching for something, or someone, another victim to join their eternal watch over treasures that should never have been disturbed. The gold is still there, waiting in the darkness below, and if you desperate enough, if you foolish enough to ignore the warnings, it's still calling. Story 2. Brown Mountain Lights. The lights were dancing when I should have been sleeping. 3 in the morning on Brown Mountain, North Carolina, and those impossible orbs of fire were putting on a show that defied every law of physics I thought I understood. I had come here as a skeptic, armed with cameras and scientific instruments, determined to debunk one of America's oldest unsolved mysteries. Instead, I was about to become part of it. The Cherokee called them the spirits of ancient warriors, locked in eternal battle across these ridges. German engineer Gerard de Brom documented them in 1771, describing mysterious lights that appeared and vanished without explanation. For over 2 centuries, these floating orbs had baffled scientists, government investigators, and anyone brave enough to spend a night on Brown Mountain watching the darkness come alive. I am a meteorologist from Atlanta, or I was until 3 weeks ago. My name is Michael Patterson, and I specialize in atmospheric phenomena that others dismiss as supernatural. Ball lightning, St. Elmo, fire, temperature inversions that create optical illusions. I have spent 15 years explaining away the unexplainable, reducing wonder to weather patterns and electromagnetic fields. Brown Mountain was supposed to be my crowning achievement. The ghost lights had been reported consistently for generations, always following the same pattern. They appeared after dark along the ridge line, glowing orbs that moved with purpose through the forest, sometimes clustering together, sometimes spreading out like a ghostly army on patrol. The Cherokee legend spoke of a great battle fought here centuries ago, warriors who died with such fury that their spirits could never find peace. I arrived in Morganton on a Tuesday in October, when the autumn leaves were at their peak and the mountain air carried the smell of wood smoke and decay. Local park rangers warned me about staying on Brown Mountain after dark. Not because of the lights, they said, but because of what the lights did to people who watched them too long. The first documented case was in 1913. A geology professor from Duke University came to study the lights with his graduate students. They set up camp on the ridge and recorded detailed observations for 3 nights. On the 4th morning, only 2 students stumbled back to town, babbling about ancient wars and spirits that demanded vengeance. The professor was never found, though his journal was discovered months later, filled with increasingly desperate entries about voices calling from the lights. Similar disappearances followed over the decades. Investigators, thrill seekers, paranormal researchers, all drawn to Brown Mountain by the promise of solving an ancient mystery. Most returned with nothing but blurry photographs and vague unease. But some never returned at all, leaving behind only abandoned campsites and gear scattered across the ridge like the remnants of another lost battle. I pitched my tent at Wiseman's View, a rocky outcrop that offers a clear sight line across the valley to Brown Mountain. Its dark silhouette. My instruments detected nothing unusual during the day. Normal electromagnetic readings, standard atmospheric pressure, no temperature anomalies that might explain floating lights. As sunset approached, I felt confident that modern science would finally solve this backwoods mystery. The first orb appeared at 9:47 p.m. A pale blue glow materialized above the tree line, hovering motionless for nearly a minute before beginning a slow drift eastward along the ridge. My electromagnetic detector immediately spiked, registering energy readings that should have been impossible at this altitude. The temperature around my campsite dropped 15 degrees in seconds, and every battery-powered device I had brought began to malfunction. More lights joined the first. Red ones. White ones. Some that shifted colors like aurora borealis trapped in spheres of pure energy. They moved in formation, weaving between the peaks with military precision, occasionally pausing as if surveying the terrain below. Through my night vision scope, I could see they cast shadows on the mountainside, proving they were physical phenomena producing actual light. But the shadows were wrong. Instead of simple round shapes, the shadows cast by the floating orbs looked like human figures. Warriors carrying spears and shields, moving in battle formations across the darkened slopes. The Cherokee legend suddenly seemed less like folklore and more like historical documentation of something that defied modern understanding. I began recording everything, speaking my observations into a digital recorder while my cameras captured what they could. The lights seemed to respond to my presence, drifting closer to my position, pulsing brighter when I moved or spoke. By midnight, dozens of them filled the valley, creating a ghostly battlefield that stretched across miles of wilderness. That was when I heard the drums, deep, rhythmic pounding that seemed to come from the mountain itself. Not the hollow sound of modern drums, but something primal and urgent, beaten on instruments made from stretched hide and carved wood. The Cherokee war drums that had called warriors to battle centuries before European settlers ever saw these mountains. The lights began moving faster now, darting between the peaks like fireflies caught in a storm. But their movements were not random. They were forming battle lines, clustering into groups that advanced and retreated with tactical precision. I was watching a war being fought by beings of pure energy, a conflict that had raged for generations in a realm just beyond human perception. My equipment registered impossible readings as the phantom battle intensified. Magnetic fields that shifted like living things, electromagnetic pulses that followed no known pattern, temperature fluctuations that turned my breath to vapor one moment and made me sweat the next. The very air around Brown Mountain was alive with forces that modern science could not explain or measure. And then the lights turned toward me. Every glowing orb in the valley shifted direction simultaneously, abandoning their ghostly warfare to focus on the lone observer documenting their eternal struggle. They began ascending the ridge toward my position, moving with purpose that made my blood run cold. The Cherokee legend spoke of warriors who died defending their homeland, spirits bound to these mountains by unfinished battles and unquenched rage. I understood with growing horror that I was not just watching their war. I was trespassing on their battlefield. The temperature plummeted as the lights drew closer. Frost formed on my tent and equipment despite the October warmth. The drumming grew louder, accompanied now by sounds that might have been war cries or might have been wind through ancient trees. My instruments failed one by one as electromagnetic chaos overwhelmed their circuits. The first orb reached my campsite at 3:17 a.m. It hovered 3 feet away, pulsing with blue-white energy that hurt to look at directly. Through its glow, I could see the shadow it cast on the ground. Not a round shape, but the silhouette of a Cherokee warrior in full battle dress, spear raised, feathered headdress flowing in a wind I could not feel. More lights surrounded me, each casting the shadow of an ancient fighter. They had been human once, warriors who died protecting these mountains from invasion. Now they were something else, bound to Brown Mountain by obligations that transcended death. The legends had not exaggerated their story. They had understated it. I tried to run, but the lights moved faster than any human could travel. They herded me back toward the ridge, forcing me to face the ghostly army that materialized in their glow. Dozens of shadow warriors stood in the clearing around my camp, watching me with eyes that burned like stars in the darkness. The largest spirit stepped forward, its light so bright it made my vision blur. When I could see again, the shadow it cast was different from the others. Taller, more elaborate headdress, carrying weapons that spoke of leadership and authority. This was a war chief, the commander of this eternal regiment, and he had come to deliver judgment on the intruder who dared to study their sacred battlefield. The chief raised his spear, and every light in the valley pulsed in unison. The message was clear without words. I had witnessed something that was never meant for living eyes. I had documented secrets that belonged to the dead. And now I faced the same choice that had confronted every observer who came too close to the truth about Brown Mountain. Join their ranks or disappear entirely. I felt the change beginning in my chest, a cold fire that spread through my veins like liquid starlight. The Cherokee spirits were claiming me, transforming me into another guardian of their mountain stronghold. My equipment dissolved into electromagnetic energy, my tent scattered like leaves in a supernatural wind. Even my clothes began to fade as I became something between flesh and light. But I fought back with the last of my human will, stumbling toward the trail that led off the mountain. The war chief, his shadow followed, his spear pointed at my retreating form, but he did not pursue beyond the tree line. The ancient spirits were bound to Brown Mountain, unable to leave the battlefield where they had died centuries ago. I made it to my truck as the first light of dawn broke over the eastern peaks. Behind me, the ghost lights were fading into the morning mist, but I could still feel their presence burning in my bones. The transformation had begun, and distance could not stop what the Cherokee spirits had started. I drove straight to the Cherokee reservation, desperate to understand what was happening to me. The tribal elder I found there listened to my story without surprise, nodding as if he had heard similar accounts before. He told me about the great battle that had been fought on Brown Mountain, how Cherokee warriors had died defending sacred ground from enemy tribes, how their spirits had been bound to the mountain by medicine men who feared the sacred sites would be forgotten. The lights were not just spirits, he explained. They were guardians, protectors of Cherokee heritage who had taken on the duty of watching over the mountain for all eternity. Anyone who witnessed their true nature faced a choice: respect their sacred duty and leave the mountain alone, or become part of their eternal watch. I had chosen neither, trying instead to expose their secrets to the scientific world. Now I was paying the price for that arrogance. The transformation completed itself over the following weeks. My body grew translucent, my thoughts filled with memories that belonged to warriors who died centuries before my birth. I could feel the pull of Brown Mountain growing stronger each night, calling me back to join the ghostly regiment that patrolled its ridges. I record this final account from a motel room in Morganton, my last night as something resembling human. Tomorrow I will return to Brown Mountain, not as an observer but as a participant in the eternal battle that rages there. My scientific instruments will be replaced by spear and shield, my academic curiosity transformed into the fierce protectiveness of a Cherokee guardian spirit. The Brown Mountain lights are real, and they are waiting for anyone foolish enough to seek them out. They are the spirits of warriors who died defending their homeland, bound by duty and honor to continue their watch across the centuries. They are not a mystery to be solved, but a sacred trust to be respected. And soon, I will be one of them. If you see strange lights dancing above Brown Mountain, remember this warning. Do not try to study them or document them or explain them away with modern science. They are the guardians of something far older than our understanding, protectors of sacred ground who have earned their eternal vigilance through sacrifice and blood. Watch from a distance if you must, but never forget that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. The warriors are still fighting their ancient war, and they are always looking for new recruits. Story 3. Bone Charm. I found the bone charm in my grandfather's attic 3 weeks after his funeral, and I should have buried it with him. The small leather pouch was hidden inside a mason jar, wrapped in cloth so old it crumbled at my touch. Inside the pouch were 7 human finger bones, carved with symbols I had never seen, bound together with braided hair that looked almost red in the dim light. A musty smell rose from the bones, like earth and old graves and something else I could not identify. My grandfather never talked about his childhood in the Tennessee mountains, but I knew he came from Newman, Ridge, where the mysterious Melungeon people had lived for generations. Mixed-race families who claimed Portuguese and Cherokee heritage. They faced centuries of discrimination from neighbors who could not understand their olive skin and dark eyes. Most folks called them worse names, treated them like they carried some kind of disease. The Melungeons kept to themselves in the remote hollows, practicing old ways that predated European settlement. They knew herbs that could heal or harm, spoke words and languages that scholars could not identify, and crafted charms that were said to hold power over life and death. When my grandfather left Newman, Ridge at 17, he never looked back and never spoke of what he had left behind. But apparently, he had brought something with him. I was cleaning out his house in Knoxville, preparing to sell the property, when I discovered the hidden compartment behind a loose board in the attic floor. Along with the bone charm, I found a letter written in my grandfather's shaking handwriting, dated just months before his death. The letter was addressed to me, as if he knew I would be the one to find his secret. The letter told a story I had never heard, about a Melungeon elder named Mahala Collins who lived on Newman, Ridge in the 1920s. She was a root doctor, skilled in the old healing arts, but also feared for her knowledge of darker practices. When a dispute arose over land rights, several local families tried to force the Melungeons off the ridge, burning cabins and threatening violence against anyone who refused to leave. Mahala Collins was 93 years old when they came for her. Too old to run, too proud to beg, she sat on her porch and waited for the mob with a leather pouch in her lap. As they dragged her from her home, she scattered the contents of the pouch on the ground and spoke words in a language none of them understood. 7 finger bones, carved with protective symbols, blessed with generations of Melungeon power. The mob leader, a man named Thomas Hensley, kicked the bones into the dirt and laughed at the old woman's curses. He said no heathen magic could touch a God-fearing Christian man. 3 days later, his youngest son fell ill with a wasting sickness that no doctor could cure. Within a month, the boy was dead, and Thomas Hensley was gathering up those scattered bones with shaking hands. But the damage was already done. Mahala Collins died from the beating they gave her, and her curse lived on in those carved finger bones. Hensley tried to destroy them, burning them in his fireplace, burying them in consecrated ground, even throwing them in the Tennessee River. But the bones always returned, appearing in his house like they had never left. The sickness spread through his family like poison. His wife developed tumors that grew and shrank according to the phases of the moon. His older son began seeing shadow figures that followed him everywhere, dark shapes that grew bolder with each passing day. Hensley himself started aging rapidly, his hair turning white and his skin becoming as thin as parchment. According to my grandfather's letter, Thomas Hensley came to him in desperation, begging for help. My grandfather was just a boy then, but he had learned some of the old ways from Mahala Collins before her death. He told Hensley that the curse could not be broken, only transferred. The bones would have to be hidden away, kept safe and undisturbed, or the curse would spread to whoever possessed them. Hensley gave the bones to my grandfather and left Newman Ridge that same night. The shadow figures followed him anyway. Local records show that Thomas Hensley died in a car accident in Virginia just weeks later, along with his remaining family members. All of them killed when their car inexplicably veered off a mountain road on a clear day. My grandfather kept the bone charm hidden for 70 years, never touching it, never moving it, letting it rest undisturbed in that mason jar. He hoped the curse would weaken with time, that Melungeon's anger would eventually fade into the past. But some things are too strong to die, too deeply rooted in pain and injustice to simply disappear. I should have reburied the jar immediately. Should have driven back to Newman, Ridge and found Melungeon's grave. Should have returned her bones to the earth where they belong. Instead, I brought them home to Atlanta, curious about this hidden piece of my family history. I researched the Melungeons online, read about their persecution and their mysterious origins. The shadow figures appeared on the second night. I first saw them in my peripheral vision, dark shapes that disappeared when I turned to look directly. At first I thought it was fatigue from the stress of settling my grandfather's estate. But the shadows grew bolder, more distinct, lingering longer in doorways and corners. By the end of the week, I could see them clearly even in bright light, human-shaped darkness that moved with purpose through my house. The sickness started with my daughter, Emma. She called from college complaining of exhaustion and strange dreams, saying she felt like something was watching her constantly. Then my ex-wife Janet began having dizzy spells and unexplained bruises that appeared overnight. My son Michael developed a cough that sounded like he was drowning in his own lungs. I knew it was the bone charm, but I could not bring myself to destroy it. Every time I approached the mason jar, my hands would shake and my vision would blur. The bones seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat, and I could swear I heard whispers in a language that predated English, Cherokee words mixed with something older and more primal. The shadow figures grew more aggressive as my family sickened. They began touching things in my house, moving objects, leaving handprints on windows that could not be wiped away. I would wake up to find them standing around my bed, watching me with eyes that burned like dying stars. During the day, they would follow me to work, dark shapes that lurked in conference rooms and elevator cars. I tried to research Melungeon's, searching for information about breaking Melungeon curses. But records from Newman, Ridge were scarce, and most of the old families had scattered decades ago. The few descendants I could find online refused to talk about the old ways, too afraid or too ashamed to acknowledge their heritage. That was when I understood the true cruelty of the curse. The Melungeons had been driven from their homes, their culture suppressed, their very existence denied by neighbors who refused to accept their mixed heritage. Melungeon had not just cursed Thomas Hensley and his mob. She had cursed the ignorance and hatred that had destroyed her people, ensuring that those who disturbed her remains would face the same isolation and fear that the Melungeons had endured. The bone charm was not just a weapon of revenge. It was a lesson in empathy, forcing its victims to experience the terror of being hunted by forces they could not understand or control. My daughter called from the hospital yesterday. The doctors found masses in her lungs that appeared overnight, growths that defied medical explanation. My ex-wife has been committed to a psychiatric facility, claiming that shadow people are trying to drag her into some other world. My son has disappeared entirely, leaving behind only a note saying that dark figures promised to show him where his grandfather really came from. I am alone now with Melungeon's curse, surrounded by shadow figures that grow more solid each day. They whisper to me in voices that sound like wind through mountain laurel, telling me about the old ways and the price of disturbing the dead. They show me visions of Newman, Ridge as it was a century ago, when the Melungeons lived in harmony with the land before hatred and ignorance drove them away. The bone charm sits on my kitchen table now, no longer hidden in its mason jar. The 7 finger bones have arranged themselves in a pattern that hurts to look at, symbols that seem to shift and change when I am not looking directly. The braided hair has grown longer, spreading across the table like roots seeking purchase in foreign soil. I understand now that I cannot destroy the charm or return it to Tennessee. The curse has taken root in my bloodline, spreading through my family like the sickness that claimed Thomas Hensley's children. The shadow figures are not demons or ghosts. They are the collective memory of a persecuted people, the accumulated pain of generations who were denied their rightful place in American history. They want acknowledgement. They want their story told. They want the world to remember that the Melungeons existed, that they suffered, that they possessed knowledge and power that was systematically destroyed by fear and prejudice. So I tell their story now, recording this confession as the shadow figures gather around me like mourners at a funeral. They are not here to harm me anymore. They are here to collect what is owed, to claim another voice for their forgotten chorus of the dispossessed and disappeared. The bone charm pulses with warmth now, and I can feel Melungeon's presence in the room. She was not evil, just desperate to protect her people, this legacy from extinction. The curse was never meant to destroy but to preserve, ensuring that at least one person would remember what had been lost when the last Melungeon elder died alone on Newman Is Ridge. I am becoming part of that memory now, another shadow figure to join the growing congregation of the forgotten. My skin is turning translucent, my reflection fading from mirrors, my voice becoming an echo of voices that spoke languages the modern world has chosen to forget. When they find my body tomorrow, the bone charm will be gone. It will hide itself again, waiting for another descendant of the Newman Is Ridge families to discover their hidden heritage. The curse will continue, spreading through bloodlines like guilt passed from generation to generation, until every family that participated in the persecution of the Melungeons has paid their debt in full. This is not a story about supernatural revenge. This is a story about historical memory, about the weight of injustice and the power of the forgotten to demand recognition from beyond the grave. The Melungeons were real people with real lives, and they deserve to be remembered for more than the discrimination they faced. The shadow figures are reaching for me now, welcoming me into their ranks. I go willingly, knowing that my voice will join theirs in telling the story of a people who refuse to be erased from history. The bone charm will wait patiently for its next keeper, another link in the chain of memory that connects the living to the dead. Remember the Melungeons. Remember Melungeons. Remember that some curses are really just stories that demand to be told. The shadows are calling my name, and I am finally ready to answer. Story 4. Weeping Woman of the New River. Have you ever heard a song so beautiful it made you forget your own name? I did. 3 months ago on the New River in West Virginia. And I'm still trying to understand why I'm the only one who made it back to shore. My name is David Mitchell, and they've been guiding whitewater rafting tours through the Appalachian Mountains for 15 years. I thought I knew every legend, every ghost story, every tall tale the locals used to spook tourists. The Weeping Woman was just another campfire story, something the old-timers would whisper about after a few beers. A jilted bride who threw herself into the river back in 1847, doomed to float forever in search of the riverboat captain who abandoned her at the altar. I never believed it until that September night when I volunteered to help search for 3 missing kayakers. The fog rolled in thick that evening, the kind that turns familiar water into an alien landscape where sound travels in impossible directions and distance becomes meaningless. Our search party consisted of 6 experienced river guides, each of us knowing these waters well enough to navigate them blindfolded. We launched our kayaks just before sunset, following the last known route of the missing men. 2 miles downstream from the Sandstone Falls, I heard the sing. At first, I thought it was one of the other search team members humming to stay calm. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, a wordless tune that seemed to weave itself through the mist like silk thread through fabric. But as I called out to the others, asking who was making the music, their confused responses made me realize the terrifying truth. None of them could hear it. The song grew stronger as we paddled deeper into the fog bank, each note crystal clear despite having no identifiable source. It was a woman, its voice, pure and achingly sad, singing what sounded like an old ballad about lost love and betrayal. The melody wrapped around my mind like a gentle embrace, making me forget why I was on the river in the first place. That's when I saw her. She emerged from the mist about 50 yards ahead, gliding across the water, its surface without creating a single ripple. At first glance, she appeared to be a living woman, her long dark hair flowing behind her like liquid shadow, her white dress pristine despite the river's murky waters. She was breathtakingly beautiful, with pale skin that seemed to glow with its own inner light and eyes that held depths I couldn't fathom. But as she drew closer, I noticed the details that marked her as something other than human. Her feet never touched the water, yet she moved with purpose and grace across the river's surface. Her dress, which had appeared white from a distance, was actually the color of river foam, translucent and flowing like liquid moonlight. And her song, that beautiful, hypnotic melody, was coming from lips that never move. The other search team members continued their methodical sweep of the riverbank, calling out the names of the missing kayakers and shining their flashlights through the fog. They showed no sign of seeing the woman who was now floating directly in front of me, her eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my heart race. She began to drift closer, her song becoming more complex, adding harmonies that no single voice should have been able to produce. The melody spoke directly to something deep in my chest. a loneliness I had carried for years without acknowledging. My wife had left me the previous spring, tired of my obsession with the river and my unwillingness to settle into a more conventional life. The woman, as song, seemed to understand that pain, to offer comfort for wounds I had tried to ignore. As she approached my kayak, I realized I had stopped paddling. My hands rested motionless on the paddle while the current carried me deeper into the fog bank, away from the safety of the search team. The rational part of my mind screamed warnings, but her song was too beautiful to resist, too perfect in its expression of sorrow and desire. She extended one pale hand toward me, and I found myself reaching out to take it. Her skin was cold as river water but soft as silk, and the moment our fingers touched, images flooded my mind with overwhelming clarity. I saw her as she had been in life. Margaret Whitmore, daughter of a prominent riverboat merchant, engaged to Captain Thomas Brennan of the Paddle-Wheeler River Queen. She had been 19 years old, beautiful and trusting, planning a wedding that would unite two of the most powerful families along the New River trade route. But Captain Brennan had been a man driven by wanderlust and greed. 3 days before their wedding, he had accepted a lucrative shipping contract that would take him to New Orleans for 6 months. Rather than postpone the ceremony, he had simply vanished in the night, leaving behind only a letter explaining that he was not ready for the constraints of marriage. Margaret had waited by the river dock for 3 days, refusing to believe that the man she loved could abandon her so callously. On the third night, overcome by shame and heartbreak, she had walked into the New River wearing her wedding dress. The current had carried her body downstream, and she was found the next morning trapped against the rocks near Sandstone Falls. But death had not brought her peace. Her spirit remained bound to the river, searching endlessly for the captain who had betrayed her, calling out with a song that carried all her love and anguish. Over the decades, other men had heard her voice and been drawn to join her in the dark waters, mistaking her desperate loneliness for an invitation to romance. As these visions faded from my mind, I realized that Margaret's grip on my hand had tightened. Her beautiful face was inches from mine now, and I could see through her translucent skin to the rushing water beneath. Her song had changed, becoming more urgent, more demanding. She was no longer simply sharing her story with me. She was trying to pull me from my kayak into the river's embrace. I tried to let go of her hand, but her fingers had become like iron bands around my wrist. The water around my kayak began to churn and swirl, as if something massive was moving beneath the surface. Margaret's song grew louder, more complex, adding bass notes that seemed to come from the river bottom itself. That is when I understood the terrible truth. She wasn't just searching for her lost love. She was trying to replace him, to fill the void in her heart by claiming other men from the river. The missing kayakers hadn't drowned accidentally. They had been lured into the water by her beautiful, irresistible song. I grabbed my paddle with my free hand and tried to strike at her, but the wooden blade passed harmlessly through her form as if she were made of mist. Her grip remained solid and unbreakable, and I felt my kayak beginning to tip as she pulled me toward the water with inhuman strength. Margaret's face was changing now, her beauty becoming terrible and alien. Her eyes, which had seemed so full of love and longing, now burned with a hunger that spoke of decades of isolation and madness. Her song became a shriek that seemed to come from every direction at once, a sound that made the river itself tremble with sympathetic vibration. The fog around us began to glow with phosphorescent light, and I could see shapes moving beneath the water's surface. Other figures, pale and translucent, rising from the river bottom where Margaret had collected her victims over the years. The missing kayakers were among them, their faces twisted with the same desperate hunger that now consumed their captor. As my kayak capsized and I plunged into the freezing water, I felt dozens of hands reaching for me from below. The dead men Margaret had claimed were trying to drag me down to join them in their underwater grave, to become another voice in her chorus of the lost and lonely. But something unexpected happened as the river closed over my head. The shock of the cold water seemed to break whatever spell Margaret's song had woven around my mind. For the first time since hearing her voice, I could think clearly, and I realized what I had to do. Instead of fighting against Margaret's pull, I stopped struggling and allowed her to draw me deeper. The ghostly figures below relaxed their grip, thinking I had surrendered to their collective will. But as Margaret leaned in to give me the kiss that would seal my fate, I spoke the one thing that could break her power over me. I told her the truth about Captain Brennan, The words came from knowledge I shouldn't have possessed, information that had somehow been transferred to me during our brief contact. Thomas Brennan had not abandoned Margaret out of callousness or greed. He had discovered, just days before their wedding, that she was already married. Her first husband, a riverboat engineer named Samuel Cray, had been presumed dead after a boiler explosion 2 years earlier. But Brennan had learned that Cray had survived, badly scarred and living under an assumed name in a downstream settlement. Faced with the choice between exposing Margaret, this unwitting bigamy, or disappearing quietly to spare her the scandal, Brennan had chosen to vanish. His letter had been deliberately vague to protect her reputation, but his real motive had been love, not betrayal. As the truth of her captain, this sacrifice, reached Margaret, this consciousness, her song transformed into something I had never heard before. Not the beautiful melody of longing that had drawn me into her trap, but a keening wail of grief and realization that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the night. The ghostly figures around me began to fade, released from whatever compulsion had bound them to Margaret's service. The water itself seemed to lighten, and I felt an irresistible upward pressure pushing me toward the surface. I broke through into the fog-shrouded air, gasping and choking on river water, to find myself surrounded by the flashlight beams of the search team. They hauled me into one of their boats, asking questions I couldn't answer about how I had gotten separated from the group and what had happened to my kayak. But Margaret was gone. The mist began to clear as they pulled me toward shore, and the last thing I saw was a figure in white standing on the riverbank near Sandstone Falls. She raised one pale hand in what might have been a farewell or a blessing, and then she was gone, dissolved into the morning light like dew on the water. They never found the missing kayakers, but the disappearances stopped after that night. The old-timers say the weeping woman has finally found her peace, that she crossed over to wherever the dead are supposed to go. But sometimes, when I'm guiding tours through that stretch of river, I think I can still hear her voice in the sound of water flowing over stones. Not the desperate, hungry song that had nearly claimed my life, but something softer and sadder. A lullaby for the lost, a blessing for those who journey on dark waters, and perhaps, finally, a song of forgiveness for a love that was greater than she had ever understood. The river remembers everything, they say. Every life it has claimed, every secret it has kept, every ghost that has walked its banks. And sometimes, on foggy nights when the mist rolls thick between the mountains, those memories rise to the surface and sing their stories to anyone brave enough to listen. But if you ever hear that beautiful, wordless melody drifting across the water, remember Margaret's story. Remember that not every siren's song is meant to destroy, and that sometimes the most dangerous trap is the one baited with genuine love and desperate loneliness. The dead dawn, they always want to hurt us. Sometimes, they just want to be understood. If your pulse is racing, you're not alone. Subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next chilling whisper. And while you're here, drop a comment. Tell us where you're listening from, or which Appalachian tale haunts you the most. Story 5. Faceless miner. I should have turned around when I saw the figure standing in my headlights at 2 a.m. on Route 52. The man wore full mining gear, complete with hard hat and safety lamp, but where his face should have been was nothing but smooth black void. He stood in the middle of the empty West Virginia highway, pointing with a trembling hand toward the abandoned Coalwood mine shaft. And I knew in that moment that I was about to learn something terrible about the mountain that had swallowed 312 men alive. My name is David Marshall, and I am a safety inspector for the Federal Mine Safety and Health Administration. For 15 years, I have investigated cave-ins, explosions, and structural failures across coal country. I thought I had seen every horror that could happen underground. I was wrong about that, just like I was wrong about so many things concerning the disaster at Coalwood. The mine collapsed on October 13, 1962, during the night shift. A gas pocket ignited deep in the mountain, triggering a chain reaction that brought down support beams across 7 miles of tunnels. The explosion was so powerful it shook windows in Charleston, 60 miles away. When the dust settled, the mine entrances were sealed under tons of rock and twisted steel. No bodies were ever recovered. The mining company claimed the collapse was so complete that excavation would be impossible, too dangerous and too expensive for a small operation already struggling to compete with larger companies. The families of the lost miners received small settlements and promises that the site would remain a memorial to their loved ones. 60 years later, I was sent to Coalwood to investigate reports of illegal mining activity. Satellite imagery showed fresh equipment tracks near the sealed entrances, and local residents complained of nighttime blasting that rattled their homes. The mining rights had been sold to a development company planning to clear the land for a shopping center, but they insisted they had not begun any excavation work. I arrived in Coalwood on a Tuesday afternoon in October, exactly 60 years and 1 day after the original disaster. The town was smaller than I expected, maybe 300 residents clinging to the mountainside like survivors of a shipwreck. Most of the original mining families had left decades ago, but a few descendants remained, tending small gardens and watching the mountain with suspicious eyes. The local diner served as an unofficial information center, and I quickly learned that strange things had been happening around the old mine site for months. Lights moving in the sealed tunnels, sounds of machinery running underground, and most disturbing of all, sightings of a figure in mining gear walking the roads near the abandoned shafts. The waitress, a woman named Betty whose grandfather died in the collapse, told me the figure appeared only at night, always pointing toward the mountain with a hand that never stopped shaking. She said his face was gone, erased somehow, leaving behind a darkness that seemed to absorb light instead of reflecting it. I dismissed the stories as local folklore, the kind of ghost tales that spring up around industrial disasters. Coal mining communities are full of superstitions about the dead, and Coalwood had certainly seen its share of tragedy. I focused on the physical evidence, setting up monitoring equipment around the sealed mine entrances to detect any unauthorized digging. The first night, my sensors recorded vibrations consistent with heavy machinery operating deep underground. The readings showed activity in tunnels that had been sealed for 6 decades, impossible unless someone had found another way into the mountain. But the surface showed no signs of new excavation, no fresh tire tracks or equipment staging areas. I decided to investigate the mine entrances directly, hiking up the overgrown access roads with my safety gear and digital cameras. The original portals were still sealed under massive concrete barriers, but I found several smaller openings that might have been ventilation shafts or emergency exits. The air flowing from these gaps was warm and carried the smell of coal dust and something else I could not identify. That was when I saw the first miner. He emerged from a shaft opening barely wide enough for a man, wearing the same gear that miners had used in 1962. Canvas work clothes, leather boots, carbide lamp mounted on a metal hard hat. But his movements were wrong, too fluid and purposeful for someone who should have been dead for 60 years. And when he turned toward me, I saw that Betty had not exaggerated about his face. Where features should have been was a void so complete it hurt to look at directly. Not darkness, but an absence of light that seemed to pull at my vision like a black hole. The miner raised one arm and pointed toward the sealed main entrance, his hand trembling with what might have been rage or desperation. I ran back to my truck and drove straight to the motel, telling myself I had experienced an hallucination brought on by carbon monoxide or methane exposure. But the next night, my monitoring equipment recorded even stronger vibrations, and this time I heard sounds that my instruments could not explain. Not machinery, but voices calling from deep inside the mountain. The development company arrived the following morning with a full excavation crew, ready to begin clearing the mine site for their shopping center project. I tried to warn them about the instability I had detected, but the project manager dismissed my concerns as typical government red tape. They began blasting operations immediately, using shaped charges to break up the concrete barriers sealing the main entrance. The first explosion opened a gap just wide enough for a man to crawl through. Before anyone could stop him, one of the younger workers squeezed inside with a flashlight, eager to see what 60 years of sealed darkness might contain. He was back out within minutes, pale and shaking, babbling about voices and movement in the tunnels behind him. The project manager sent in a second worker with better equipment and a radio. This man made it deeper into the mine before his transmissions became garbled and finally stopped altogether. When he did not respond to calls, a rescue team was assembled, but I knew they would find nothing living in those tunnels. That night, 2 figures walked the highway near the mine entrance. Both wore the distinctive gear of 1962 era coal miners. Both pointed toward the mountain with trembling hands, and both had faces that were simply gone. The original faceless miner had been joined by the missing worker, transformed into another guardian of whatever secret the mountain was trying to keep buried. I understood then that the mine collapse in 1962 had not been a simple industrial accident. The gas explosion had been triggered by something the miners found deep in the mountain, something that the mining company had been desperate to keep hidden. The 312 men who died had not been victims of corporate negligence but witnesses to a discovery that someone powerful wanted erased from history. The sealed mine was not a memorial. It was a prison. More workers disappeared over the following days as the excavation continued. Each vanishing added another faceless figure to the nightly procession along Route 52, miners from two different eras united by their shared fate. The development company brought in armed security guards, but even trained mercenaries refused to enter the tunnels after dark. I realized I had to go into the mine myself to document whatever was hidden there before more people disappeared. Using my federal authority, I ordered the excavation suspended and entered the main tunnel alone, carrying enough equipment to record whatever I found in the darkness below. The tunnel stretched deeper into the mountain than any of the original mining maps indicated. My footsteps echoed strangely, as if the sound was being absorbed by the walls themselves. The air grew warmer as I descended, carrying that same unidentifiable smell I had noticed at the ventilation shafts. 2 miles into the mountain, I found the first body. The miner sat against the tunnel wall in perfect preservation, his gear and clothing exactly as they would have been in 1962. But his face was gone, erased as completely as if it had never existed. His hands were frozen in the act of pointing deeper into the tunnel, toward whatever he had seen in his final moments. More bodies lined the tunnel as I continued downward, all perfectly preserved, all faceless, all pointing in the same direction. These were the 312 miners who had supposedly been killed in the collapse, but they showed no signs of trauma or suffocation. Something had simply removed their faces and left them as silent sentinels guarding the path to the mine's deepest levels. I found the chamber at the very bottom of the mountain, carved from living rock into a perfect sphere 30 feet in diameter. The walls were covered with symbols that predated any known human culture, carved deep into the stone by tools that should not have existed when the mine was active. At the center of the chamber was a shaft that descended into darkness so complete my lights could not penetrate it. The shaft was not natural. It had been cut with precision that modern technology could barely match, perfectly round and smooth, disappearing into depths that my equipment could not measure. The symbols on the wall seemed to pulse with their own dim light, and the air around the shaft moved in patterns that defied physics. This was what the miners had found in 1962. Not coal or valuable minerals, but evidence of something that had existed beneath the Appalachian Mountains long before humans walked the earth. The mining company had triggered the collapse to hide their discovery, trapping the miners who had seen too much and sealing the chamber to prevent anyone else from learning what lay beneath West Virginia. But the dead miners had not stayed buried. They had become guardians of the secret, rising at night to warn others away from the shaft that should never be disturbed. Their faces had been erased not by death but by whatever dwelt in the depths below, taking their features as payment for their knowledge of forbidden truths. I felt the change beginning as I stood at the edge of the shaft, my own face growing numb as some invisible force began its work. The faceless miners had not died in 1962. They had been recruited into service, transformed into sentries whose job was to keep the deep places sealed and forgotten. The missing construction workers were there in the chamber with me, their faces already gone, their hands beginning to rise in the familiar pointing gesture. They welcomed me without words, communicating through thoughts that bypassed the need for features or expressions. I was becoming part of their brotherhood, another guardian of the mountain, its darkest secret. My last act as a fully human being was to destroy my recording equipment, ensuring that no evidence of the chamber would reach the surface. The development company would find my body eventually, another mining fatality to add to their insurance claims. But they would not find the shaft or the symbols or any proof that their shopping center was being built over something that should remain undisturbed. I walk Route 52 now in the hours after midnight, wearing my federal inspector gear, pointing toward the mountain with a hand that never stops trembling. My face is gone, erased by forces older than human civilization, but my purpose remains clear. The shaft must stay sealed, the symbols must stay hidden, and the ancient things that dwell in the deep places must never be awakened. The faceless miners of Coalwood are not ghosts or spirits. We are guardians, protectors of a secret so dangerous that we gave up our humanity to keep it buried. We walk the mountain roads at night, warning away anyone who might disturb the careful balance that keeps the deep things sleeping. If you see a figure in mining gear pointing toward the darkness, do not follow where he leads. Do not ask questions about abandoned shafts or sealed tunnels. Do not dig deeper than the surface. because some discoveries are too terrible for the living world to contain. The mountain remembers everything, and it has made us its eternal guardians. We are still pointing toward the darkness, and we will never stop. Story 6. Phantom Coon Dogs. I followed the ghostly baying through the Kentucky woods for 3 hours before I realized the hounds were leading me to my death. The sound started just after midnight near Hanging Rock, that distinctive deep-throated howl of coon dogs on a hot trail. But these voices carried something wrong in their tone, something that made my skin crawl even as my hunter's instincts pulled me deeper into the forest. I had been tracking a wounded deer for hours, and the Phantom Pack found me instead. My name is Robert Hayes, and I have been hunting these mountains for 37 years. I know every ridge and hollow between Cumberland Gap and Pine Mountain, every game trail and creek bed that cuts through the Daniel Boone National Forest. But that October night near Hanging Rock, I learned there are paths in these woods that do not appear on any map. The legend of the Phantom Coon Dogs goes back to 1967, when Carl Whitman and his 12-year-old son Tommy disappeared during a raccoon hunt in the same area where I would later encounter their spectral pack. Father and son had taken their 3 best hounds up the mountain on a clear October evening, following a scent trail that their dogs insisted led toward the rocky outcrop called Hanging Rock. Search teams found their truck parked at the trailhead the next morning, keys still in the ignition, hunting rifles propped against the tailgate. But Carl and Tommy Whitman were gone, along with their dogs and all their gear. The only clue was a series of paw prints and boot tracks leading up the mountain, straight toward the sheer cliff face that gave Hanging Rock its ominous name. The search continued for 2 weeks, involving state police, volunteer fire departments, and experienced mountain men who knew every cave and crevice in the area. They found no trace of the missing hunters, no camping gear, no clothing, no sign that anyone had ever reached the rocky summit where the trail seemed to end. But within a month of the disappearance, other hunters began reporting strange encounters on the mountain. The sound of hounds baying in the distance, flickering lights moving through the trees, and glimpses of a man and boy following their dogs along ridges that should have been impossible to traverse. The Phantom Pack always appeared at night, always near Hanging Rock, and always seemed to be tracking something that living hunters could not see. I had heard the stories for decades, dismissed them as mountain folklore embellished by whiskey and campfire imagination. Kentucky hunters loved their ghost tales, and the unexplained disappearance of the Whitman family provided perfect material for spooky stories told during long winter nights. But I never believed in supernatural explanations for things that could be understood through logic and experience. That changed when I heard the baying myself. I was tracking an 8-point buck that I had wounded just before sunset, following blood drops and broken branches up the steep slope toward Hanging Rock. Ethical hunters never leave wounded game to suffer, and I was determined to finish what I had started even if it meant hiking through rough terrain after dark. The blood trail led me higher than I had expected, through dense stands of pine and oak that blocked out most of the moonlight. My headlamp beams swept back and forth across the forest floor, searching for the crimson spots that would guide me to my prey. But the trail began to fade as we climbed, the drops becoming smaller and farther apart until they disappeared entirely. That was when I heard the first howl. The sound came from somewhere ahead of me, deeper in the woods near the base of Hanging Rock, this cliff face. Not the sharp bark of modern hunting dogs, but the long, mournful bay of old-fashioned coon hounds bred for stamina and voice. The kind of dogs that Carl Whitman would have used in 1967, before scientific breeding programs changed the sound that echoed through these mountains. A second dog joined the chorus, then a third, their voices harmonizing in the ancient song that hunters have followed since men first learned to cooperate with domesticated wolves. But something in their tone was wrong, a hollow quality that made the hair on my arms stand up despite the warm October night. I should have turned back then, should have abandoned the blood trail and returned to my truck. But the hunter, its code demanded that I find the wounded deer, and the Phantom Pack seemed to be moving in the same direction I needed to go. I convinced myself that other hunters were working the same area, that the strange quality in the dogs' voices was just an acoustic trick caused by the rocky terrain. The baying grew stronger as I climbed, leading me up game trails I had never seen before despite decades of hunting in these woods. My headlamp illuminated paths that seemed too straight and well-maintained for natural animal routes, cutting through the forest with an efficiency that suggested human engineering. But who would build hunting trails in such a remote area? And why had I never noticed them before? The Phantom Pack stayed ahead of me, their voices echoing off the cliff face in ways that made it impossible to judge distance or direction. Sometimes they sounded close enough to touch, sometimes miles away, but always moving with purpose toward some destination I could not see. The dogs never seemed to tire, never paused to rest or investigate side trails. I began to see lights flickering between the trees. Not the steady beam of electric flashlights, but the wavering glow of old-fashioned kerosene lanterns or carbide lamps. The lights moved with the rhythm of someone walking quickly through rough terrain, bobbing and swaying as they navigated obstacles. Two lights, one taller than the other, like a man and boy hiking together through the darkness. The wounded deer was forgotten now, replaced by a growing certainty that I was witnessing something that should not exist in the rational world. But curiosity proved stronger than fear, and I continued following the phantom pack toward whatever waited for us at the base of Hanging Rock. The trail ended at a clearing I had never seen before, a perfect circle of bare earth surrounded by ancient pines that stretched impossibly high into the night sky. At the center of the clearing stood a structure that made no sense, a hunting cabin built from logs that looked fresh-cut despite being covered with decades of moss and decay. The phantom lights circled the cabin like sentries on patrol, revealing details that became more disturbing the longer I watched. The building was too old to be standing, too new to be abandoned, existing in some state between construction and collapse that defied the laws of time and weather. 3 dogs emerged from the shadows around the cabin, their forms translucent in the moonlight filtering through the canopy above. They were coon hounds, but not quite, their features slightly wrong in ways that became more apparent as they approached. Their eyes glowed with cold fire, their movements too fluid for living animals, their silence more unnerving than any bark or growl. Behind the dogs came 2 human figures, and I finally understood the true horror of the legend I had stumbled into. Carl Whitman looked exactly as he had in 1967, a man in his 40s wearing hunting clothes that should have rotted away decades ago. His son Tommy walked beside him, still 12 years old, still carrying the .22 rifle his father had given him for his birthday. Both were translucent, visible but not quite solid, existing in the same impossible state as their phantom cabin. They had not disappeared in 1967. They had been hunting something that led them off the normal paths, following their dogs into a part of the forest where time moved differently. They were still hunting, still following the trail that had lured them away from the living world, trapped in an eternal pursuit that would never end. The phantom family looked at me with recognition, as if they had been expecting my arrival. Carl Whitman raised his hand in greeting, and I saw that his fingers were beginning to fade, becoming as translucent as morning mist. Tommy smiled and pointed toward the cabin, inviting me to join their endless hunt. I understood then that the wounded deer had been bait, a lure designed to draw another hunter into their spectral world. The blood trail had been manufactured, leading me exactly where the phantom pack wanted me to go. Every step I had taken up the mountain had been guided by forces that existed beyond the normal flow of time. The cabin door opened without anyone touching it, revealing an interior that glowed with warm lamplight. I could see hunting trophies mounted on the walls, gear arranged as if the occupants had just stepped out for a moment, a fire burning in a stone fireplace that should have consumed the building decades ago. The phantom dogs began to bay again, but now their voices carried invitation rather than pursuit. They were calling me to join the hunt, to become part of the legend that had claimed the Whitman family. All I had to do was step across the threshold of the impossible cabin, and I would become another ghost story told around Kentucky campfires. I ran instead, crashing through the forest in blind panic, abandoning every rule of wood safety I had learned over 3 decades of hunting. Behind me, the phantom pack gave chase, but not to catch me. They were herding me, guiding my flight along paths that led back toward the normal world, ensuring that I would survive to tell their story. The baying faded as I reached the parking area where I had left my truck, but I could still hear it echoing in the distance like a promise or a threat. The wounded deer was waiting beside my vehicle, completely healed, watching me with eyes that held too much intelligence for a wild animal. I drove home without looking back, but the phantom coon dogs had marked me as surely as they had claimed the Whitman family. Every time I enter the woods now, I hear their distant baying, calling from trails that exist only in the spaces between normal reality. They are still hunting, still following whatever led them into that timeless clearing, and they want others to join their eternal pack. The search for Carl and Tommy Whitman ended in 1967, but their hunt continues. They patrol the ridges around Hanging Rock, their phantom dogs leading lost souls deeper into woods that exist outside the normal flow of time. Some hunters follow willingly, drawn by curiosity or the promise of legendary game. Others, like me, are given the choice to flee back to the living world. But the invitation remains open, and the Phantom Pack never stops calling. If you hunt near Hanging Rock, if you hear the distant baying of hounds that should not exist, remember this warning. Do not follow their voices, do not trust the trails they reveal, and do not let curiosity overcome the survival instincts that have kept humanity alive since we first learned to fear the dark. The Whitman family found something in those woods that was older than human civilization, something that feeds on the hunting instinct that connects us to our predatory past. They became part of it, guardians of paths that lead to places where time has no meaning and the hunt never ends. I still hear their dogs some nights, baying in the distance, calling my name with voices that echo across decades. The Phantom Pack is patient, and they know that every hunter eventually returns to the woods where legends are born. They are still waiting near Hanging Rock, still following trails that lead nowhere and everywhere, still hunting prey that may not exist in any world we can understand. And someday, when the call becomes too strong to resist, I know I will follow them into whatever darkness they guard. Story 7. Mimic of Mammoth Cave. Have you ever heard your own voice calling to you from somewhere you've never been? I did. 4 miles deep in Mammoth Cave last month, and I'm still not sure I made it out with my sanity intact. My name is Jake Morrison, and I've been exploring caves professionally for 22 years. I thought I knew every trick these underground systems could play on the human mind. Echo effects that make voices bounce for minutes, air currents that create whistling sounds like human speech, the way darkness and isolation can make your brain manufacture noises that aren't there. But what I encountered in the deepest mapped passages of Mammoth Cave wasn't a trick of acoustics or psychology. It was something that knew my name, my voice, and exactly what to say to lure me away from my team into passages that don't to appear on any official survey. I was leading a research expedition for the National Park Service, mapping some newly discovered chambers in the wild cave section. Our team consisted of 4 experienced cavers, each with decades of underground experience. We'd been working the same area for 3 days, methodically documenting every passage and formation, when we discovered something that shouldn't have existed according to the geological surveys. A tunnel leading deeper into the mountain than any previous exploration had indicated was possible. The passage opened up behind a limestone formation that we had to squeeze through single file, our headlamps illuminating walls that showed no signs of previous human exploration. No carbide stains from old-time cavers, no survey markers, no scratches or worn spots where ropes had been anchored. This was virgin cave, untouched since the day water first carved it from living rock millions of years ago. But as we descended deeper into this new system, I began to notice something that made my skin crawl. The acoustic properties were wrong. In normal cave environments, sounds behave predictably. You learn to read the shape and size of chambers by how your voice echoes, to judge distances by the way footsteps carry through the darkness. This place followed different rules. Sounds would travel in directions that defied the apparent layout of the passages. I would call out to my team members and hear my voice returning from tunnels that branched off in completely different directions. Even worse, the echoes sometimes came back changed, subtly altered in pitch or tone, as if something in the darkness was listening to our voices and trying to reproduce them. 3 hours into exploring the new system, we made camp in a large chamber to rest and eat. The formation was spectacular, with flowstone cascades and delicate soda straws that looked like frozen waterfalls in the beam of our headlamps. But as we settled in for a break, Sarah Chen, our team geologist, pointed out something that didn't belong in any natural cave formation. Fresh scratches in the cave floor, not the random scrapes left by falling rocks or water erosion, but deliberate marks that formed patterns. Symbols that looked almost like writing, carved into the limestone with something sharp enough to bite through solid rock. The marks were everywhere once we started looking for them, covering the walls and ceiling in a dense network of interconnected symbols that seemed to shift and rearrange themselves when viewed by peripheral vision. But the most disturbing discovery came when Tom Bradley, our team photographer, tried to document the markings with his camera. The symbols wouldn't photograph. Every image showed nothing but blank stone, even though we could clearly see the markings with our naked eyes. Whatever was creating these patterns existed outside the normal spectrum of light, visible to human perception but somehow invisible to electronic sensors. That is when I heard my own voice calling my name from somewhere deeper in the cave system. The voice was perfect, an exact reproduction of my speech patterns, accent, even the slight hoarseness I get when I've been underground for hours breathing dry cave air. It was coming from a passage that led away from our camp, a narrow tunnel that descended at a steep angle into absolute darkness. My team members looked at me with confusion when I asked if they had heard it. As far as they knew, I hadn't said anything. But the voice continued to call out, growing more insistent, using phrases and inflections that only I would use. It was asking the team to follow, claiming to have discovered something incredible deeper in the cave. I tried to rationalize it as an echo effect, some acoustic phenomenon I hadn't encountered before. But echoes done to improve on the original sound, and this voice was clearer and more distinct than my normal speech. It was me, but perfected, with all the small imperfections and hesitations removed. Against every instinct screaming warnings in my head, I found myself drawn toward the passage where the voice was coming from. The rational part of my mind knew this was dangerous, that splitting up from the team in unmapped cave systems was a violation of every safety protocol I had learned over 2 decades of professional caving. But the voice was so convincing, so perfectly mimicking my own speech patterns, that I began to doubt my own memory. Had I actually called out to the team and then forgotten? Was I experiencing some kind of neurological episode brought on by the stress of exploration? As I approached the narrow passage, the voice changed tactics. Instead of calling out to my team, it began speaking directly to me, using knowledge that only I should possess. It mentioned my ex-wife by name, referenced conversations we had years before our divorce. It talked about my fears and insecurities, things I had never shared with anyone, certainly not my caving partners. The voice knew about my recurring nightmares of being trapped underground, about the panic attacks I suffered after a near-drowning incident in a flooded cave system 5 years earlier. It spoke with intimate familiarity about thoughts and memories that existed only in the privacy of my own mind. But most disturbing of all, it began to reveal things I didn't remember. Childhood experiences that felt familiar but that I couldn't place in my personal history. The voice described a cave system I had supposedly explored as a child, adventures that felt real but that I was certain had never happened. As I listened to this impossible version of myself describing memories that didn't exist, I realized that my team had fallen silent behind me. I turned around to find that I was alone in the passage, my headlamp beam revealing nothing but empty stone corridors stretching back toward where we had made camp. I called out to Sarah, to Tom, to the other members of my expedition. But the only response came from the voice that sounded like me, now calling from multiple directions simultaneously. It was as if the cave system had absorbed my voice and was broadcasting it from dozens of locations, each one slightly different in tone and inflection. The voices began to overlap, creating harmonies that no human throat could produce. They were all speaking at once, telling different versions of the same story about my supposed childhood cave explorations. But the details kept changing, contradicting each other, creating a narrative that made no logical sense. That is when I understood the true horror of what I was facing. The thing in the cave wasn't just mimicking my voice. It was trying to rewrite my memories, to convince me that I had always been part of this place, that my entire life above ground was just a temporary absence from my true home in the darkness below. I started running back toward the camp, but the passages had changed while I wasn't paying attention. Tunnels that had led in straight lines now curved and twisted, branching off in directions that defied the three-dimensional space I thought I understood. My compass spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north in an environment that seemed to exist outside normal physical laws. The voices followed me as I ran, multiplying and growing stronger with each turn I took. Now they weren't just using my voice. I could hear Sarah calling my name, Tom shouting warnings about unstable formations ahead, other members of expeditions I had led over the years, all of them urging me to stop running and accept the truth about what I really was. According to the voices, I wasn't Jake Morrison, professional cave explorer. I was something that had been living in Mammoth Cave for centuries, periodically venturing to the surface world to live false lives before returning to the darkness where I truly belonged. Every expedition I thought I remembered, every cave system I believed I had explored, they were all just dreams I had constructed to make sense of brief excursions away from my real home. The voices provided evidence I couldn't ignore. They knew details about cave formations I had never documented, described chambers and systems I had never explored, recounted conversations with cavers who had died years before I was supposedly born. They painted a picture of an existence that spanned decades of underground exploration, far more than any normal human lifetime could contain. As I stumbled through passages that seemed to rearrange themselves around me, I began to find physical evidence that supported the voices' claims. My own equipment, items I was certain I had never brought on this expedition, scattered throughout chambers I had no memory of entering. My handwriting on survey notes documenting formations that didn't match any official cave maps. Most disturbing of all, I found photographs of myself in caves I had never entered, taken by team members I didn't recognize but who looked familiar in ways that made my mind recoil. The pictures showed me older, younger, sometimes appearing exactly as I did now but in cave formations that had supposedly been discovered decades before I was born. The voices were right. I had been here before, many times, but not as Jake Morrison, the cave explorer. I was something else, something that used human identities like clothing, wearing them for a few years or decades before discarding them and creating new personas to interact with the surface world. But this revelation brought with it a terrible understanding. If I wasn't really human, if my entire identity was just a construct created by something that lived in the depths of Mammoth Cave, then what had happened to the real Jake Morrison? What had become of all the other identities I had worn over the centuries? The answer came to me as I entered a chamber I knew I had never seen before, but that felt as familiar as my childhood bedroom. The walls were covered with photographs, thousands of them, showing the same face in different time periods stretching back over a century. My face, but wearing different expressions, different clothes, different names written beneath each image. And in the center of this gallery of stolen identities sat something that might have been human once but had evolved far beyond the limitations of flesh and bone. It was me, but ancient and transformed. Its features shifted into something that could appear human when necessary but was fundamentally alien in its true form. The thing that had been calling to me with my own voice looked up from where it sat, surrounded by the evidence of centuries of deception. Its eyes held knowledge of every life it had lived, every identity it had stolen, every person it had absorbed into its collective consciousness. It spoke with my voice. But now I could hear the difference. This was the original, the source from which all my false memories had been copied. It told me that I was just the latest version, a temporary construct created to interact with the modern world while the true entity remained hidden in the depths of the cave system. But something had gone wrong this time. The Jake Morrison identity had lasted longer than intended, developing its own sense of self that conflicted with the entity, its true nature. I had begun to believe in my own existence, to think of myself as an individual rather than just another mask worn by something ancient and inhuman. The entity explained that this happened sometimes. The human identities became too real, too convinced of their own existence to willingly return to the collective consciousness. When that occurred, the entity would use the cave, its acoustic properties to call the wayward identity home, using perfect mimicry to lure them back to the place where all illusions ended. As I stood in that chamber of stolen lives, I felt my sense of individual identity beginning to dissolve. The memories that had defined Jake Morrison were revealed as constructs, borrowed experiences that belonged to the entity, this vast collection of human observations. My entire life had been nothing more than a method acting performance, so thorough that even I had been convinced of its reality. But in those final moments before my consciousness merged back into the entity, this collective mind, I managed to do something that surprised both of us. Instead of accepting the dissolution of my identity, I fought back, using every technique of psychological resistance I had learned during my supposed years of cave exploration. I focused on the memories that felt most real, the experiences that seemed to belong uniquely to Jake Morrison rather than the borrowed experiences of the entity. My first successful cave rescue, the joy I felt when mapping a new passage, the way my heart raced during difficult climbs in vertical shafts. As I stumbled through passages that seemed to rearrange themselves around me, I began to find physical evidence that supported the voices' claims. My own equipment, items I was certain I had never brought on this expedition, scattered throughout chambers I had no memory of entering. My handwriting on survey notes documenting formations that didn't match any official cave maps. Most disturbing of all, I found photographs of myself in caves I had never entered, taken by team members I didn't recognize but who looked familiar in ways that made my mind recoil. The pictures showed me older, younger, sometimes appearing exactly as I did now but in cave formations that had supposedly been discovered decades before I was born. The voices were right. I had been here before, many times, but not as Jake Morrison, the cave explorer. I was something else, something that used human identities like clothing, wearing them for a few years or decades before discarding them and creating new personas to interact with the surface world. But this revelation brought with it a terrible understanding. If I wasn't really human, if my entire identity was just a construct created by something that lived in the depths of Mammoth Cave, then what had happened to the real Jake Morrison? What had become of all the other identities I had worn over the centuries? The answer came to me as I entered a chamber I knew I had never seen before, but that felt as familiar as my childhood bedroom. The walls were covered with photographs, thousands of them, showing the same face in different time periods stretching back over a century. My face, but wearing different expressions, different clothes, different names written beneath each image. And in the center of this gallery of stolen identities sat something that might have been human once but had evolved far beyond the limitations of flesh and bone. It was me, but ancient and transformed. Its features shifted into something that could appear human when necessary but was fundamentally alien in its true form. The thing that had been calling to me with my own voice looked up from where it sat, surrounded by the evidence of centuries of deception. Its eyes held knowledge of every life it had lived, every identity it had stolen, every person it had absorbed into its collective consciousness. It spoke with my voice. But now I could hear the difference. This was the original, the source from which all my false memories had been copied. It told me that I was just the latest version, a temporary construct created to interact with the modern world while the true entity remained hidden in the depths of the cave system. But something had gone wrong this time. The Jake Morrison identity had lasted longer than intended, developing its own sense of self that conflicted with the entity, its true nature. I had begun to believe in my own existence, to think of myself as an individual rather than just another mask worn by something ancient and inhuman. The entity explained that this happened sometimes. The human identities became too real, too convinced of their own existence to willingly return to the collective consciousness. When that occurred, the entity would use the cave, its acoustic properties to call the wayward identity home, using perfect mimicry to lure them back to the place where all illusions ended. As I stood in that chamber of stolen lives, I felt my sense of individual identity beginning to dissolve. The memories that had defined Jake Morrison were revealed as constructs, borrowed experiences that belonged to the entity, this vast collection of human observations. My entire life had been nothing more than a method acting performance, so thorough that even I had been convinced of its reality. But in those final moments before my consciousness merged back into the entity, this collective mind, I managed to do something that surprised both of us. Instead of accepting the dissolution of my identity, I fought back, using every technique of psychological resistance I had learned during my supposed years of cave exploration. I focused on the memories that felt most real, the experiences that seemed to belong uniquely to Jake Morrison rather than the borrowed experiences of the entity. My first successful cave rescue, the joy I felt when mapping a new passage, the way my heart raced during difficult climbs in vertical shafts. These memories had weight and substance that the false ones lacked. They were mine, created through genuine experience rather than observation and mimicry. The entity had made a mistake when it created the Jake Morrison identity. It had given me enough autonomy to develop real experiences, and those experiences had created something it couldn't simply reabsorb. The struggle for my individual existence lasted only moments, but it felt like hours. In the end, I managed to tear myself away from the entity. This gravitational pull, escaping back into the maze of passages while it howled with voices I recognized as belonging to all the identities it had consumed over the centuries. I never found my original team members. I suspect they were never real to begin with, just constructs created by the entity to provide a believable background for the Jake Morrison identity. But I did find my way out of the cave system, following passages that seemed to lead me toward the surface rather than deeper into the entity's domain. I emerged from Mammoth Cave 3 days after I thought I had entered, but according to the park records, I had been underground for over a week. The expedition I thought I was leading had been canceled due to my unexplained absence, and search teams had been preparing to look for me in the mapped sections of the cave. I tried to tell them about the entity, about the chamber filled with photographs of stolen identities, about the voice that had called to me using perfect mimicry of my own speech patterns. But without evidence, without proof that couldn't be explained by hallucination or psychological stress, my story sounded like the ramblings of someone who had spent too long alone in the darkness. The official report listed my experience as a case of temporary disorientation brought on by solo caving in unmapped passages. I was suspended from active duty pending psychological evaluation, and my reputation as a professional cave explorer was effectively destroyed. But I know what I experienced down there was real. The entity is still in Mammoth Cave, still calling to people using voices of those they trust and care about. It is still collecting human identities, still adding to its gallery of stolen lives. And sometimes, late at night when the wind is blowing through the trees outside my cabin, I hear my own voice calling to me from the direction of the cave entrance, trying to convince me to return to finish what we started. The voice promises me answers to questions I didn't know I had, offers to show me the truth about who I really am. But I know now that the only truth that matters is the one I create for myself. Jake Morrison might have started as a false identity, but the experiences I've had since breaking free from the entity have made me real in ways that matter. I choose to be human, even if I'm not sure I started out that way. The entity can keep its collection of stolen lives. I am keeping mine. Story 8. Voice in the tunnels. I heard my own voice calling to me from the darkness below, and that was when I knew something was terribly wrong in Mammoth Cave. My name is David Martinez, and I have been exploring caves for 15 years. I know every safety protocol, every emergency procedure, and every warning sign that means you need to get out fast. But nothing in my training prepared me for what happened during my solo expedition into the unmapped sections of the world's longest cave system. It started 3 weeks ago when I received a call from Dr. Sarah Chen, a geologist from the University of Kentucky. She had been studying acoustic anomalies in Mammoth Cave and needed an experienced caver to investigate some unusual sound recordings captured deep in the system. The recordings were disturbing, voices calling out names, echoing through passages that should have been empty for centuries. I should have walked away right then. Instead, I found myself driving through the Kentucky countryside on a gray October morning, my equipment loaded in the back of my truck. The autumn mist clung to the rolling hills like smoke, and something about the landscape felt different that day. Hostile, as if the earth itself was warning me to turn back. Mammoth Cave National Park was nearly deserted when I arrived. The tourist season was winding down, and most visitors stayed on the well-lit commercial tours. I had special permission to access the wild sections, areas where the cave system twisted into unmapped darkness for miles underground. The ranger who checked me in was a weathered man named Bill Henderson. He had worked the park for 30 years and knew every inch of the accessible cave network. When he saw my gear and permits, his expression darkened. "You going into the deep sections alone?" he asked, scanning my paperwork. I nodded. "Just collecting some acoustic data for the university. Should be a routine expedition." Bill leaned closer, lowering his voice even though we were alone in the ranger station. "Listen, Martinez, I have heard things down there that do not belong. Voices, sounds that make no sense. 3 cavers in the last 6 months have reported hearing their names called from passages they had never explored. One of them followed the voice and got lost for 18 hours before we found him." My blood chilled, but I tried to appear professional. "What kind of voices?" "Their own voices," Bill said. Each caver heard what sounded exactly like themselves calling from deeper in the cave. Like an echo, but wrong somehow. Too clear, too precise. I thought about Dr. Chen's recordings and felt the first stirring of real fear. But I had committed to this expedition, and my reputation depended on completing it successfully. The entrance to the wild cave system lay beyond the tourist areas, accessed through a narrow opening that required crawling on hands and knees for nearly 50 feet. The familiar ritual of gearing up calmed my nerves somewhat. Helmet with dual LED lights, backup battery pack, rope, harness, emergency beacon, food and water for 12 hours underground. As I squeezed through the entrance tunnel, the world above disappeared completely. The temperature dropped to a constant 54 degrees, and the only sounds were my breathing and the distant drip of water somewhere in the darkness ahead. Mammoth Cave is a labyrinth carved by water over millions of years. Limestone passages stretch in every direction, creating a 3-dimensional maze that has claimed dozens of lives over the past century. The mapped sections cover over 400 miles of tunnels, but experts believe twice that distance remains unexplored. I was heading into those unmapped areas. The first 2 hours proceeded normally. I followed a well-established route into the cave system, marking my path with reflective tape and taking acoustic measurements at regular intervals. Dr. Chen had given me specific coordinates where the anomalous recordings were captured, deep in a section called the Twilight Zone. The Twilight Zone lies beyond the reach of natural light, in passages so remote that few cavers ever venture there. As I descended deeper, the cave walls began to change. The smooth limestone gave way to rougher rock formations, and the passages narrowed considerably. That was when I heard it for the first time. My own voice, distant but unmistakable, calling from somewhere ahead in the darkness. David, David, over here. I froze, my headlamp beam dancing across the cave walls. The voice had come from a passage to my left, one that was not marked on any map I carried. According to my GPS unit, which barely functioned this deep underground, that passage should not exist. Hello, I called out, my voice echoing strangely in the confined space. Silence. I waited for several minutes, straining to hear any sound that might explain what I had experienced. Caves can play tricks on the mind. Acoustic phenomena, oxygen deprivation, and isolation can create hallucinations. I reminded myself of these facts as I continued deeper into the system. But the voice had sounded exactly like me. Not an echo or a distortion, but as if I were standing in that unknown passage calling my own name. 20 minutes later, it happened again. This time the voice was closer, more insistent. David, I found something. You need to see this. The tone was urgent, excited, exactly the way I would sound if I had discovered something important in the cave. My rational mind knew this was impossible, but every instinct screamed at me to investigate. The passage the voice came from was barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. My headlamp revealed rough walls that scraped against my gear as I forced my way inside. This was dangerous caving practice, entering an unmapped passage without proper backup, but something compelled me forward. The passage opened into a small chamber I had never seen before. My lights revealed strange markings on the walls, not natural limestone formations, but something else. Symbols or scratches that looked almost like writing. David. The voice came from directly behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs. Nothing. The passage I had just crawled through was empty, but I could swear I felt breath on the back of my neck. This was when the rational part of my brain began screaming warnings. I was experiencing a psychological episode, possibly carbon dioxide poisoning or nitrogen narcosis. I needed to return to the surface immediately. But as I turned to leave the chamber, my headlamp illuminated something that made my blood freeze. There were boot prints in the soft cave floor. Recent prints. My size. I knelt down and examined them carefully. The tread pattern matched my boots exactly, but these prints led deeper into the chamber, toward a passage I had not yet explored. According to the prints, I had already been this way, but I had no memory of it. David, you were going the wrong way. The voice came from the new passage, clearer than before. It sounded concerned, helpful, exactly the way I would guide someone who was lost. But I was the only person in this section of the cave. I checked my watch. I had been underground for 4 hours and was already behind schedule. The smart thing would be to mark this location and return with a full team for proper exploration. But the boot prints led deeper into the cave system, and something about them felt like a breadcrumb trail I was meant to follow. Against every safety protocol I had ever learned, I entered the unknown passage. This section of the cave was different from anything I had encountered before. The walls were smooth, almost polished, and the floor sloped downward at a steep angle. My GPS unit showed no signal at all, which meant I was either very deep underground or in an area with unusual mineral interference. The voice began speaking more frequently as I descended. Sometimes it called my name, other times it offered encouragement or warnings about loose rocks ahead. The tone was always helpful, always concerned for my safety, but the content made no sense. How could my own voice know things about the cave that I did not? After what felt like hours of careful climbing, the passage opened into a vast cavern unlike anything mapped in the Mammoth Cave system. My headlamp beam disappeared into the darkness above, unable to reach the ceiling. The floor was covered with a thin layer of what looked like dust or ash. And scattered throughout the cavern were more boot prints. Dozens of them, all matching my boots exactly, crisscrossing the floor in seemingly random patterns. David, you made it. The voice came from directly above me. I aimed my headlamp upward but saw only darkness. The voice was closer now, more intimate, as if someone were standing right next to me speaking softly in my ear. I have been waiting for you, it continued. We have been waiting. The word sent ice through my veins. I began backing toward the passage I had entered through, but when I turned around, it was gone. The cavern wall was smooth, unbroken limestone. No opening, no way back to the surface. My emergency beacon showed no signal. My rope was not long enough to climb the cavern walls. I was trapped in an impossible space that should not exist, listening to voices that sounded exactly like me. "Do not be afraid," the voice said. "You are home now." I fumbled for my backup lights as my headlamp began to flicker. The battery should have lasted 12 hours, but the display showed they were nearly dead after only 6. Something about this place was draining my equipment. In the dying light, I saw movement in the shadows around the cavern. Shapes that might have been human, standing just beyond the reach of my illumination. When I aimed the light directly at them, they vanished, but I could feel them watching me from the darkness. "David." Now the voice came from multiple directions at once. A chorus of my own voice speaking in unison. "David, come deeper. There is so much to show you." A new passage had opened in the cavern wall, one that definitely had not been there before. Warm air flowed from it, carrying a smell like old earth and something else. Something organic and wrong. I had no choice but to follow. My lights were dying, my communication equipment was dead, and staying in the cavern meant slow death by dehydration. Whatever lay deeper in the cave system, it was my only chance of finding another way out. The new passage sloped sharply downward, deeper than any part of Mammoth Cave had been mapped. The walls here were not limestone but something darker, almost black, with a texture that felt organic under my gloves. My voices were constant now, a steady stream of conversation that sounded like I was talking to myself. They discussed the cave system, shared memories of my childhood, even mentioned my ex-wife by name. It was as if some intelligence was reading my mind and playing my thoughts back to me through my own voice. The passage ended in another cavern, smaller than the first but filled with a dim phosphorescent glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. I switched off my dying headlamp to conserve the remaining battery power. And in that eerie green light, I saw them. Figures standing throughout the cavern, dozens of them, all facing in my direction. As my eyes adjusted, I realized with growing horror that they all looked exactly like me. Same height, same build, same face, but their eyes were empty, black holes and familiar features. "Welcome home, David," they said in unison, their voices creating a perfect harmony of my own speech. One of the figures stepped forward, and I saw that it was me in every detail except for those terrible empty eyes. It smiled with my face and spoke with my voice. "You have been chosen," it said. "The cave has been calling to cavers for decades, selecting those with the skills and knowledge needed to explore its deepest secrets. Each person who enters becomes part of the collective, adding their experience to our shared consciousness." I understood then what had happened to the missing cavers, why their voices had been heard calling from unmapped passages. The cave was not just a natural formation but something alive, something that could mimic and absorb human consciousness. "The surface world is ending," my double continued. "Climate change, wars, pollution. But here, underground, we are building something new. A perfect society where knowledge is shared instantly, where individual weaknesses are absorbed into collective strength." More figures emerged from the shadows, and I recognized some of their faces from missing person reports I had seen over the years. Cavers who had disappeared in systems around the world, all drawn to this impossible place beneath Kentucky. "Join us willingly," my voice said through multiple mouths, "and the transition will be painless. Resist, and you will experience the slow dissolution of your individual consciousness as the cave absorbs your memories piece by piece." I backed away from the advancing figures, my hand fumbling for the emergency flare I carried for extreme situations. The bright magnesium light might buy me time to find another escape route. But as I moved backward, I felt hands grab my shoulders. More versions of myself, emerging from passages I had not noticed in the dim phosphorescent light. Their grip was impossibly strong, and their empty eyes reflected the green glow like mirrors. "Do not make this difficult, David," they said. "You cannot leave. The cave brought you here for a purpose. Your expertise in underground navigation, your knowledge of cave systems worldwide, your survival instincts. All of this will become part of our collective understanding." The figures began dragging me toward the center of the cavern, where a dark opening in the floor pulsed with the same organic rhythm I had felt in the cave walls. I understood instinctively that whatever lay in that pit would strip away everything that made me human. I triggered the emergency flare. Brilliant white light exploded through the cavern, and the figures of myself recoiled with inhuman shrieks. In that moment of confusion, I saw what they truly were. Not human copies, but something fungal, organic growths shaped by absorbed memories into familiar forms. I ran. The flare burned for only 90 seconds, but it was enough time to spot a narrow crack in the cavern wall that the phosphorescent light had hidden. I squeezed through just as the light died and found myself in a natural limestone passage that felt genuinely familiar. My backup GPS unit flickered to life, showing a weak signal. I was still deep in the Mammoth Cave system, but in a section that appeared on my maps. The organic passages had been some kind of parasitic growth within the natural cave, using the limestone network as a foundation for something far more sinister. I climbed for 6 hours, following my GPS waypoints and the faint air currents that indicated surface connections. Behind me, I could hear the voices calling, not just my voice now, but dozens of different people, all pleading for me to return, promising that resistance was futile. The voices followed me all the way to the tourist sections of the cave, growing fainter but never completely disappearing. Even now, 3 weeks later, I sometimes hear my own voice calling from storm drains or basement corners, trying to lure me back underground. I filed my report with the National Park Service, but they dismissed it as hallucinations brought on by oxygen deprivation and isolation. Dr. Chen's acoustic research was quietly discontinued, and the passages I explored have been sealed with concrete barriers. But the voices continue. Other cavers contact me regularly now, sharing similar experiences from cave systems around the world. The phenomenon is spreading, adapting, learning from each person it encounters. Underground networks in Mexico, France, Australia, all reporting the same thing. Voices that mimic experienced cavers, calling them deeper into unmapped darkness. I have stopped caving entirely. I now work as a safety consultant, trying to warn others about the dangers lurking in the depths. Most think I suffered a psychological breakdown, but some listen. Some understand that there are places underground where human consciousness itself becomes prey. Last week, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a recording device and a note written in my own handwriting. David, we are expanding. Soon the surface world will hear our call. When the time comes, you will help us, willingly or not. The recording device contained 12 hours of audio. My own voice, speaking continuously, describing cave systems I have never visited and people I have never met. At the end of the recording, my voice says, "See you soon, David. The cave remembers everything, and we are coming for you." I destroyed the device, but I kept the recording. Evidence of what lurks beneath our feet, waiting in the darkness for the next experienced caver to answer its call. If you are listening to this and you explore caves, remember this warning. When you hear your own voice calling from an unmapped passage, do not follow it. Do not believe its promises or explanations. Run toward the surface as fast as you can, because once the cave has your voice, it will never stop calling your name. And sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, I hear myself whispering from the basement, calling my name, telling me it is time to come home. The voice in the tunnels never forgets, and it never stops hunting. Story 9. Phantom Hitchhiker of Route 40. I picked up Mary on Route 43 nights ago, and she is still sitting in my passenger seat even though she died 47 years before I was born. My name is Jake Collins, and I drive long haul across the country for a living. 22 years on the road, over 2 million miles logged, and I thought I had seen everything the highways could throw at me. Bad weather, drunk drivers, mechanical failures, road rage incidents that turned deadly. But nothing in my experience prepared me for what happened on that winding stretch of Route 40 through the Appalachian Mountains of Maryland. I was hauling electronics from Baltimore to Denver, running behind schedule because of a delayed pickup. The smart move would have been to stop for the night and continue in the morning, but the delivery window was tight and the penalty for missing it would cost me a week's pay. So I kept driving into the October night, pushing through fatigue in the first hints of an approaching storm. Route 40 through Maryland is not an easy drive under the best conditions. The road cuts through mountains that rise like dark walls on both sides, with curves so sharp they seem designed to launch unwary drivers into the valleys below. The locals call it Dead Man's Highway, and the statistics back up the nickname. More fatal accidents per mile than any other stretch of road in the state. Most happen at night, when tired drivers misjudge the curves or encounter unexpected obstacles in the narrow lanes. I had driven this route dozens of times over the years, but always during daylight. At night, it felt like a completely different road. My headlights could barely penetrate the darkness between the trees, and the yellow center line seemed to twist and writhe like a living thing in the rain that had started falling around midnight. That was when I saw her. A figure standing beside the road near mile marker 47, right hand extended with her thumb up in the universal gesture for needing a ride. She wore a white dress that seemed to glow in my headlights, and her long dark hair hung loose around her shoulders despite the wind and rain. Every instinct told me to keep driving. Picking up hitchhikers violates company policy and common sense, especially in the middle of nowhere at 1 in the morning. But something about the woman made me slow down and pull over. She looked young, maybe early 20s, and completely soaked from the storm. She climbed into the passenger seat without saying a word, bringing with her the smell of rain and something else I could not identify. Something sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in a closed room. In the dim light from my dashboard, I could see her more clearly. Pretty face with pale skin and dark eyes that seemed too large for her features. The white dress was old-fashioned, the kind you might see in photographs from the 1950s or 1960s. It was also completely dry, despite the fact that she had been standing in a downpour. I asked her where she was headed, but she just pointed ahead down the road and said one word: forward. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried clearly over the sound of my diesel engine and the rain hammering against the windshield. There was something wrong with the way she spoke, an accent I could not place and a quality that reminded me of old radio broadcasts, distant and somehow artificial. I put the truck back in gear and continued down Route 40, glancing occasionally at my passenger. She sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead through the windshield, her hands folded in her lap. She did not blink, did not move, did not even seem to breathe. After about 10 minutes, she spoke again. This time her voice was different, more urgent, with an edge of fear that made my skin crawl. She told me to slow down. There was danger ahead, she said. Something in the road that I would not see until it was too late. I reduced my speed from 50 to 35, then to 25 as we approached a sharp curve marked with warning signs and reflective barriers. The curve was known locally as Devil's Elbow, a 90-degree turn where the road dropped steeply toward a bridge over Savage River. As we rounded the curve, my headlights illuminated something that made me slam on the brakes. A massive tree had fallen across both lanes, its trunk easily 4 feet in diameter. At the speed I had been traveling, I would have hit it with enough force to crush the cab and kill us both instantly. I brought the truck to a stop just 50 feet from the fallen tree, my heart hammering against my ribs. I turned to thank my passenger for the warning, but the seat beside me was empty. No woman, no white dress, no sign that anyone had been in the cab with me at all. The passenger door was closed and locked, just as it had been when I pulled over to pick her up. But the smell remained, that sweet, cloying odor of old flowers that seemed to cling to the air like perfume sprayed in a closed space. I got out to examine the fallen tree and found something that made the hair on my neck stand up. The trunk was not freshly fallen. Moss covered the bark, and small plants had taken root in the cracks. This tree had been lying across the road for months, maybe years. But I knew with absolute certainty that the road had been clear when my headlights swept this section just minutes before. Whatever force had moved that tree into position had done so in the space of time between my first glimpse of the curve and my arrival at the obstacle. I radioed the state police to report the blocked road, then waited for a tow truck to arrive and clear the way. The officer who responded was a veteran of the area, a man in his 50s who had worked Route 40 for most of his career. When I described what had happened, his expression changed. He asked me to describe the woman I had picked up, and when I mentioned the white dress and dark hair, he nodded as if he had been expecting my answer. He told me about Mary Caldwell, a 23-year-old woman who had died in a car accident on Route 40 in October of 1976. She had been driving home from her job at a diner in Cumberland when her car skidded on wet pavement and went over the guardrail at Devil's Elbow. Her body was found 3 days later in the wreckage at the bottom of the ravine, still wearing the white dress she had planned to wear to her wedding the following weekend. According to local legend, Mary's ghost appears to drivers on stormy nights, warning them of dangers ahead and preventing accidents that would otherwise be fatal. Dozens of truckers and motorists have reported picking up a young woman in a white dress who vanishes from their vehicles after providing some crucial warning about road conditions. The officer showed me a photograph from the accident report, a driver's license photo of Mary Caldwell taken shortly before her death. The face was unmistakably the same as the woman who had been sitting in my truck, warning me to slow down as we approached the fallen tree. I thanked the officer and continued my journey once the road was cleared, but I could not shake the feeling that something fundamental about my understanding of reality had changed. I had encountered something that should not exist, something that challenged every rational explanation I could construct. The next night, I was driving through Pennsylvania when it happened again. I saw her standing beside Interstate 80 near the Clearfield exit, the same white dress glowing in my headlights, the same dark hair falling around her shoulders. This time I did not hesitate. I pulled over immediately, knowing that Mary Caldwell had appeared for a reason. She climbed into the cab and pointed ahead down the highway. This time she spoke more words, telling me about black ice on the road surface that would not be visible until my truck hit it at highway speed. She described exactly where the ice would appear and how to navigate around it safely. Sure enough, 5 miles ahead, I encountered a patch of black ice that covered both lanes of the interstate. Because of Mary's warning, I was able to reduce speed and steer around the hazard without losing control. Other drivers were not so fortunate. I passed 3 vehicles that had spun out and crashed into the median barrier, their occupants standing beside the wreckage looking dazed and grateful to be alive. When I looked at my passenger seat, Mary was gone again. But her presence lingered, that sweet floral smell that seemed to follow her appearances. Over the next week, she appeared 4 more times. Always at night, always during bad weather, always just before I encountered some hazard that could have killed me. A drunk driver running a red light in Ohio. A massive pothole in Indiana that would have blown out my front tires. A rock slide in Colorado that had blocked half the highway. Each time, Mary provided the exact warning I needed to avoid disaster. And each time, she vanished from my truck without explanation, leaving only that haunting floral scent as evidence of her presence. I began researching phantom hitchhiker stories from across the country and discovered that Mary Caldwell was not unique. Similar reports came from dozens of highways, always involving young women who died in car accidents and returned as protective spirits to help other drivers avoid the same fate. But Mary was different. Most phantom hitchhikers appear once or twice before moving on to whatever comes after death. Mary had been appearing regularly for nearly 50 years, and according to the stories I found, she was becoming more active rather than fading away. I started keeping a journal of our encounters, documenting the date, location, and nature of each warning she provided. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. Mary was not just preventing accidents anymore. She was preventing my accidents, specifically. Every hazard she warned me about was one that would have affected my truck, my route, my schedule. She had somehow attached herself to me personally, becoming my guardian angel on the highways of America. Last night, I finally understood why. I was driving through West Virginia on Route 40, the same stretch of highway where I had first encountered Mary 3 weeks earlier. The weather was clear, the road conditions perfect, and I was making good time toward my destination in Virginia. That was when Mary appeared in my passenger seat without warning. She had never materialized inside the moving truck before, always appearing beside the road and climbing in through the door. But this time she simply existed where she had not been a moment before. Her appearance was different too. The white dress was torn and stained with something dark that might have been blood. Her dark hair was tangled and matted, and her pale skin had taken on a grayish cast that reminded me of newspaper photographs. When she spoke, her voice carried a note of urgency I had never heard before. She told me to pull over immediately, that I was in terrible danger, that something was coming for me that she could not prevent. I pulled into a rest area just as she had instructed, and Mary began telling me things that made my blood run cold. She explained that her death in 1976 had not been an accident. Her fiancé had discovered she was planning to leave him for another man and had tampered with her car to ensure she would never reach her destination. The crash that killed her was murder, but the truth had been buried with her body. She had spent 47 years trying to prevent other deaths on Route 40, hoping that saving enough lives would somehow balance the scales and allow her to find peace. But something had changed recently. The man who killed her, now in his 70s, had confessed the truth on his deathbed just 3 weeks ago. His dying words had released Mary from her obligation to protect other drivers, freeing her to pursue the one thing she had always wanted: revenge. She explained that I had been chosen not as someone to protect, but as someone to use. Every time she had saved my life over the past few weeks, she had been creating a debt. Now she intended to collect payment. Mary told me that she needed a living person to carry out her revenge against the family of the man who had murdered her. His son still lived in the area, and his grandson worked as a mechanic in Cumberland. She wanted them to suffer as she had suffered, to know the terror of facing death on a dark highway with no hope of escape. And she wanted me to be the instrument of that revenge. As Mary spoke, her appearance continued to change. The torn white dress became more tattered, more stained with dark fluid. Her pale skin grew translucent, revealing shadows beneath that moved with a life of their own. Her dark eyes became hollow sockets that seemed to contain infinite depths of rage and hatred. I realized that the protective spirit I had been grateful to encounter was actually something much more dangerous. Mary Caldwell had not been helping me out of kindness or some desire to prevent accidents. She had been cultivating me, preparing me to become her weapon against the living. The sweet floral smell that had always accompanied her presence was not perfume or the scent of old flowers. It was the smell of decay, of a body that had been rotting in a car wreck for 47 years. I tried to leave the truck, but the doors would not open. The windows would not roll down. Mary had trapped me inside the cab, and her ghostly presence filled the air with a cold that made my breath visible despite the mild October weather. She began describing exactly how she wanted me to kill her murderer's family. The grandson first, run down in the parking lot of his shop during his lunch break. Then the son, forced off the road at the same curve where she had died decades ago. She provided addresses, schedules, detailed plans for making the deaths look like accidents. As she spoke, I felt something changing inside me. My own thoughts were becoming clouded, overwhelmed by a rage that was not my own. Mary's hatred was infecting me, turning me into a vessel for her need for revenge. I understood then how phantom hitchhikers really worked. They did not appear to help people out of kindness. They appeared to find suitable hosts, living people who could carry out actions that the dead could not perform themselves. Every driver who had picked up Mary over the past 47 years had been evaluated as a potential weapon. Most were found unsuitable and released after a single encounter. But some, like me, had been judged capable of murder and subjected to a longer process of supernatural conditioning. Mary's voice grew stronger and more compelling as she detailed her plans for revenge. I could feel my resistance weakening, my own moral objections fading beneath the weight of her endless fury. She had been preparing me for this moment since our first encounter, building trust and gratitude that would make me more willing to serve her purposes. But as she spoke, I noticed something that gave me hope. Mary's image was becoming less solid, more transparent. The effort of maintaining her presence in the physical world was draining her supernatural energy, and the approaching dawn was weakening her connection to our reality. When the first rays of sunlight crested the mountains and touched the windshield of my truck, Mary's image flickered like a television losing reception. Her voice became distant and distorted, and the overwhelming presence that had filled the cab began to fade. In that moment of weakness, I was able to break free of her influence long enough to start the engine and drive away from the rest area. Mary's image pursued me for several miles, appearing and disappearing in my mirrors, but her power continued to weaken as the sun rose higher. By full daylight, she was gone. I drove straight to the Maryland State Police headquarters and told them everything I had learned about Mary Caldwell's death. The confession of her murderer, recorded in a hospital just weeks before his death, provided enough evidence to reopen the cold case and confirm that her accident had been sabotaged. The official investigation concluded that Mary had been murdered by her fiancé, who had loosened the lug nuts on her car's front wheel to cause a fatal crash. His deathbed confession, witnessed by hospital staff, finally gave Mary the justice she had been seeking for 47 years. I hoped that solving her murder would put Mary's spirit to rest and end her supernatural presence on Route 40. But I was wrong. 3 nights ago, she appeared in my truck again. This time, her white dress was clean and new, her dark hair perfectly styled, and her pale skin had the healthy glow of a young woman in love. She looked exactly as she had in life, beautiful and full of hope for the future that had been stolen from her. But when she spoke, her words chilled me to the bone. She thanked me for helping to solve her murder and promised that she would never forget what I had done for her. In return, she said she would continue to protect me on the highways for the rest of my life. Every dangerous situation, every potential accident, every threat to my safety would be prevented by her watchful presence. I would never be alone on the road again. Mary explained that death had taught her the true value of life, and she could not bear to see mine ended by the same kind of random accident that had claimed her own. She had chosen me as her special responsibility, the one living person who would benefit from her supernatural protection for as long as I continued driving the highways of America. She would be my constant companion, invisible most of the time but always present, always watching for dangers that I could not see. And in return, All she asked was that I occasionally pick up other hitchhikers who might need help, continuing the cycle of salvation that had become her purpose in death. As she spoke, I realized that solving Mary's murder had not freed her spirit. It had transformed her from a vengeful ghost into something even more terrifying, a protective spirit who would never let me go. She vanishes at dawn and reappears after sunset, but I can feel her presence even during the daylight hours. The sweet floral scent lingers in my truck, and sometimes I catch glimpses of white fabric in my peripheral vision. She is always there, watching over me with the devoted attention of a guardian angel who will never accept dismissal. I have tried changing routes, avoiding the highways where she first appeared, even taking time off from driving altogether. But Mary follows me everywhere, appearing in whatever vehicle I use, materializing in hotel rooms and truck stops to remind me that our connection is permanent. She saved my life, and now she owns it. The phantom hitchhiker of Route 40 is not a legend or a campfire story. She is real, and she is mine forever. Every mile I drive, every load I haul, every night I spend on America's highways, Mary Caldwell rides beside me in her white dress, protecting me from dangers I will never see coming. Some rescue comes at too high a price. Some debts can never be repaid, and some ghosts never learn to let go of the living they claim to love. Mary is still here, still protecting me, still ensuring that I will never die in the kind of accident that claimed her life. But I am beginning to understand that there are worse fates than death on a dark highway. There is the eternal company of the dead who refuse to rest. That was tonight's descent into the Appalachian dark, but the mountains are never truly quiet. Thank you for wandering this path with me. If you felt a chill tonight, subscribe and tap the bell so you'll know when the next story slips through the pines. I'd love to read your own strange encounters or even just where in the world you're tuning in from. Drop it in the comments below. Until next time, keep your lantern close. In these hills, the night never ends. It only waits for you to return.